Long Beach, New York is a small coastal town that has always been known for its tranquility and well-being. Here, among the cozy streets, beautiful houses and sounds of the surf, life seemed measured and safe. The locals knew each other, greeted their neighbors on the streets, and felt part of a unified community. In this quiet place, it was hard to imagine that someday a violent crime would occur here that would shock everyone and make you doubt the people you had known all your life. One such respected resident was Teresa Kiel, a strong, intelligent, and determined woman who dedicated her life to the education and development of children. She worked as a teacher and school principal in Nassau County, where over the years she earned respect and recognition among her colleagues, students, and their parents. Teresa loved her work. For her, education was not just a profession but a calling. She sincerely believed that the right education and quality teaching could change the lives of her students and give them a chance for a better future. Strict but fair, she always put the interests of children above everything else and did her best to create the best conditions for them to learn and grow. Her colleagues respected her for her extraordinary dedication and commitment to improving the educational system. Her teaching methods were innovative, and her ideas for improving the learning process inspired her colleagues. Teresa was more than just a school principal. She was a leader, someone who led and exemplified a true professional. But beyond her work, Teresa was a very active person. She was interested in technology, business, and entrepreneurship, always looking for new opportunities for self-realization. In recent years, she was actively working on the development of a new project, a unique dating app that could bring people together and offer an intelligent approach to finding a partner. This project was more than just a business for her. She believed in its success and invested time, effort, and money, hoping that it would open new perspectives for her. After becoming successful in education, she wanted to try something new, create something meaningful, and contribute to modern technology. She dreamed that one day she would be able to develop the project to a major level, attract new investors, and turn the idea into a successful business. But for now, she was just starting on this path, and there were some tough challenges ahead of her. Despite her success in her career, the most important thing in Teresa's life was always her family. She had a daughter, Teresa Keel, whom she loved and supported immensely. Teresa was proud of her daughter. Francesca was a talented, ambitious, and driven girl who strived for independence, but always knew she could count on her mother. They spent a lot of time together, discussing their studies, careers, and future. They had a warm and close relationship, filled with mutual understanding and trust. Teresa always supported Francesca in her aspirations, gave advice, shared her experience, and helped her find the right solutions in difficult situations. They were not just mother and daughter, but true friends. There was an atmosphere of comfort and calmness in their home. They often had dinner together, discussed the news, watched movies, and on weekends they could take a walk on the beach or go shopping in the neighboring town. Life seemed happy and full of prospects. Everything seemed perfect. A prosperous family, a successful career, new professional horizons. Teresa was sure that only better times were ahead of her. On the evening of the 4th of December, 2016, Long Beach, New York, was living its normal life. But as darkness fell, the rhythm slowed down. People dispersed to their homes and the streets became almost deserted. Teresa Keel finished another day of work and headed home as usual. She lived alone in a cozy apartment, in an apartment complex, a few blocks from the coast. Driving through the familiar streets, she parked her car, turned off the engine, and picked up her bag of papers. It was an ordinary evening, no different from hundreds of others. Everyday thoughts, plans for tomorrow, a little tiredness after work. Teresa closed the car, adjusted her coat, and headed for the front door. The next morning, the 5th of December, around 7:30, Teresa's neighbor, Mary Ellis, was leaving her apartment, getting ready to go shopping. Her morning route was always the same. She would leave early, go to the nearest supermarket, and then return home to avoid the crowds. But as she descended the stairs, she noticed something strange. A woman's bag lay by the front door, with her keys and phone scattered nearby. In the darkness of the entryway flickered scarlet spots on the floor. They stretched along the wall and ended at the motionless body. The neighbor froze with horror. She slowly approached, and her breath hitched. There was Teresa Keel lying face down on the floor. Her hair was soaked with blood, her clothes were in disarray, and her right eye was practically ruined. Mary couldn't scream. She frantically pulled out her cell phone and dialed 911. "Urgent. There's a woman here. She's covered in blood. I think she's dead." When the first police officers entered the entryway, they were met with an eerie silence, only broken by the echo of their own footsteps. Despite the morning hour, the air in the building was tense, as if the house itself held traces of the horror that had taken place. The first thing that caught the investigators' eye was the dark bloodstains on the floor, which stretched from the front door to the stairs, but stopped after only a few steps. This indicated that the attack was sudden and the victim was unable to get far. The perpetrator had given her no chance of escape. A quick examination of the scene allowed the police to draw several important conclusions. First, Teresa Keel never made it to her apartment. Her keys were found next to her body. Her bag was lying aside, but the things inside were untouched. That rules out robbery. If the perpetrator wanted to take valuables, he would have taken at least a phone or a wallet, but everything was still there. The second important fact is that there were no signs of struggle. There were no objects scattered around, no signs of the victim trying to defend himself. Everything said that the attacker had struck the first blows instantly, without giving Teresa even a chance to realize what was happening. Paramedics who arrived on the scene had already taken Teresa to the hospital in extremely serious condition, but there were still traces of blood on the floor. Forensic experts scrutinized them and concluded that the killer had used a blunt, heavy object, possibly a metal pipe or something similar. The blows were delivered with great force, and the main blow was on the right side of the head, which meant that the perpetrator was probably right-handed. However, the main thing that police determined was that the attacker had struck repeatedly, with a clear desire not just to frighten or harm, but specifically to kill. After the initial examination of the entryway, interviews with neighbors began. However, to the surprise of the investigators, almost none of the residents did not hear anything unusual. Those who were already asleep did not pay attention to any sounds, and the rest were either busy doing their own things or simply did not pay attention to the muffled blows. One of the neighbors recalled that during the night she thought she heard a door slam or a heavy object fall somewhere, but she did not pay attention to it at that moment. Only one elderly woman, who lived on the first floor, said she had seen a silhouette in the window in the late evening, but because of the darkness, she could not make out a face or details of clothing. Police scrutinized the front door and windows but found no signs of forced entry. This was another red flag. If the perpetrator had not forced his way in, it meant that either the victim had opened the door herself or he was waiting for her inside the entryway, knowing when she would return home. This led investigators to believe that the killer may have known Teresa and knew her routine. If it was a random attack, the robber would have likely snatched her purse or run off with her belongings, but that didn't happen. Everything said that this was not a spontaneous act of violence, but a carefully planned crime. But who would want a respected woman who had dedicated her life to education dead? Teresa Keel had no criminal record, no dangerous activities, no enemies among her colleagues or acquaintances. Outwardly, her life seemed calm and prosperous, but, as it turned out later, her personal affairs hid more secrets than one could assume. Investigators began to reconstruct the events of Teresa's last days, studying her contacts, calls, and correspondence. But first they decided to talk to the person who was closest to the victim, her daughter, Teresa Kiel. Usually in such situations, close relatives are grief-stricken, shocked, find comfort in memories, or, on the contrary, withdraw into themselves. However, the way Francesca behaved at the interrogation immediately aroused suspicion among the investigators. From the first minutes of communication, she seemed calm, even too calm. There was no trace of tears on her face. She did not look depressed or shaken. At times, her expression even seemed relaxed. She sat across from the investigators with the look of someone who was uncomfortable being here, not because she was in shock or grief, but rather because the whole situation seemed to her to be an unnecessary formality. She showed no concern or attempt to learn the details of the investigation, which in itself seemed unusual. When asked when she had last spoken to her mother, Francesca hesitated for a moment, and then hesitantly replied that it had been a few days ago, but she could not remember the exact date. This seemed strange to the investigators. Usually a person clearly remembers the last contact with family members, especially if something tragic happened afterwards. She also expressed no concern that her mother might have been out of contact for several days. Her answers were reserved and her intonation was indifferent. When asked about her relationship with her mother, she shrugged and said that they had a normal relationship. There was no anger or love in her words, as if Teresa was just a person to her, not a close relative. This made the investigators suspicious, since mother and daughter not only kept in touch, but had previously lived together. If there was no conflict between them, why was Francesca so indifferent to what had happened? Her behavior became even more bizarre going forward. When the investigators reported that her mother had been brutally beaten, Francesca's face did not change. Normally, even a trained person would involuntarily give out emotion at the mention of such details. But she nodded calmly and said that she had heard about it. It was also surprising that she didn't ask a single question about the details of the attack. People who have lost loved ones want to know who could have done it, whether there are suspects, what versions the police are considering. But Francesca was not interested in that. Moreover, at one point, she herself tried to steer the investigation in a certain direction. When asked if her mother had any enemies, she quickly replied that Teresa had conflicts, especially in business, and it was possible that this could be connected with the murder. Her words felt like a prearranged version, as if she wanted to dismiss any other suspicions at once. The culmination of Francesca's strange behavior was her explanation of her own condition. When one of the detectives openly expressed surprise at her equanimity, she was not embarrassed. She said that there was no point in being grief-stricken, as it would not change anything, and that she preferred to keep a rational approach. However, this answer seemed too detached to the investigators. It did not explain the complete lack of emotion, which could be written off as shock. After questioning Teresa Kiel, investigators had a strong suspicion that she either knew more than she was saying or was directly involved in her mother's murder. At that point, however, the police had no clear evidence, only intuition and the daughter's suspicious behavior. To confirm or deny the speculation, they began an in-depth examination of her phone calls, correspondence, and financial transactions. The first thing detectives did was check her recent calls and texts. Examining this data quickly yielded the first unexpected result. In the weeks leading up to the murder, Francesca had been actively texting and calling one person far more often than anyone else. That person was Ralph Kepler, her boyfriend, and also a former correctional officer. This fact alerted the investigators not only because Francesca was silent about him in the interview, but also because Kepler himself had a direct connection to the victim. It turned out that he had worked with Teresa Kiel to develop a dating app, but their business partnership ended in conflict. Ralph and his family invested money in the project, but then he suspected Teresa of fraud, claiming she mismanaged the funds. At one point, he even sued her, demanding a refund. This new fact dramatically changed the course of the investigation. The police now had a possible motive. If Kepler believed that Teresa had stolen money from him, it could provoke a desire for revenge. Moreover, investigators now had a connection between him and Francesca. Examination of phone records showed that Francesca was at home at the time of the murder, but she had been actively texting Ralph that evening. Particularly alarming were the messages sent in the hours before the attack. Some of them looked like coded phrases, perhaps indicating a readiness for action. It was too suspicious to be a coincidence. In addition, the police found an interesting detail in her financial transactions. Shortly before the murder, she had purchased a GPS tracker. Upon further investigation, it turned out that this GPS tracker was installed on her mother's car, and alerts about Teresa's movements came to Francesca's email account. This meant that the daughter knew her mother's exact location on the day of the attack. The police now had a clear motive, and the first tangible evidence linking Teresa Kiel and Ralph Kepler to the crime. However, before drawing final conclusions, they decided to personally interrogate Kepler. His involvement had not been proven, but the investigators wanted to hear his version of events. They called him in for questioning without revealing all the information they had already gathered. The investigation suspected that Kepler not only knew more than he was telling, but could have been directly involved in the brutal attack. As soon as he entered the interrogation room, investigators were ready for unexpected revelations. When Ralph Kepler walked into the interview room, he looked confident, as if everything that was going on didn't concern him. A former correctional officer, he knew how interrogations were conducted, and seemed confident that he could withstand the pressure of the investigators. However, the police had already gathered enough evidence to force him to talk. From the outset, he behaved calmly, denying any involvement in the attack on Teresa Kiel. He claimed that he was at home on the day of the murder and had nothing to do with what happened. The investigators did not immediately reveal to him everything they had on their hands. They began with questions about his relationship with Teresa, the lawsuit between them, and their business partnership. Kepler answered dryly, with obvious irritation, trying to show that he did not consider the conflict to be anything significant. The detectives then presented him with phone records and correspondence with Teresa Kiel. They indicated that he had been in contact with her in the hours before the attack, discussing her mother's movements. The police further presented evidence that Francesca had purchased a GPS tracker, and its data was being fed into her email. This meant that she was tracking Teresa's every move, and Ralph knew when the victim would return home. Gradually, his confidence began to crumble. He looked away more and more often, swallowed nervously. His hands began to shake. The pressure from the investigators was building. They reminded him that his financial situation had improved dramatically in the hours after the attack. He had paid off some of the debts that had dogged him for years. The evidence was too clear, and he realized it. Investigators offered him a deal. If he testified fully, his charges could be reconsidered, reducing his sentence. That was the moment he finally broke down. Realizing that there was no way out, Kepler confessed that together with Francesca planned the murder of her mother. He said that it was Francesca's idea to get rid of Teresa. She hated her mother, believing that she was interfering with her life by controlling her finances and personal relationships. In addition, Francesca knew that if her mother died, she would receive a large inheritance. She suggested that Kepler carry out the attack, portion of that money. He was initially hesitant, but being in desperate financial straits, he finally agreed. On the day of the murder, Francesca followed her mother's movements and relayed her whereabouts to Kepler. He waited for Teresa in the entryway of her home, knowing that she was not expecting an attack. Once inside, he struck her several times with a metal barbell. After fatally wounding her, he left the body and fled, later meeting with Francesca to discuss next steps. Kepler also confirmed that one of the main reasons for the murder was money. Teresa controlled her daughter's finances, and Francesca wanted to get rid of her mother in order to get her inheritance and freedom. They expected that the attack could be portrayed as a random robbery, but didn't take into account that investigators would quickly notice inconsistencies.
In the death of Keel's mother, 56-year-old Teresa Keel, investigators say Kepler crushed Keel's skull with a barbell outside her Long Beach home.
After his confession, police formally charged him with murder. Now investigators had not just a suspect, but a witness who gave a full statement and directly accused Teresa Keel of organizing the crime. A few days after the interrogation, on the 24th of January 2018, Ralph Kepler was arrested at the correctional facility on Rikers Island where he worked. This moment came as a real shock to his colleagues, because they could not imagine that a man who worked in the field of law enforcement was capable of committing such a brutal crime. He was charged under the article attempted murder, but after the death of Teresa Keel, the qualification of the crime was changed to premeditated murder in the second degree. After Kepler's arrest, the district attorney's office continued the investigation, gathering new evidence. Investigators reviewed Francesca's phone records, financial transactions and correspondence, and examined her behavior after the attack. Everything pointed to the fact that she not only knew about the crime but actively participated in its preparation. After the attack, Teresa Keel spent almost 2 years in a vegetative state, never regaining consciousness. Investigators hoped that if she woke up, she would be able to name her attacker, but doctors gave no chance. Her injuries were too severe. Police visited the hospital regularly, hoping to record some reaction, but consciousness never returned. Her body gradually gave up, and on the 10th of November, 2018, Teresa passed away before she could testify.
Eventually passing away at North Shore Manhasset Hospital Saturday evening.
After her death, the case was reclassified as a homicide. Now the investigation had to work without the victim's word, relying only on evidence. The police already had prime suspects. Just 1 day after her mother's death, on the 11th of November, 2018, Teresa Keel was officially arrested. Her detention took place at the home she shared with Kepler in Lynbrook. Police officers expected her to start denying her involvement, but her reaction was different. When she was informed that Ralph had made a full confession and named her as the main organizer of the crime, Francesca could not withstand the pressure. Realizing that her co-conspirator had already testified, Francesca did not persist and agreed to a deal with the investigation. Unlike Kepler, who was charged with second-degree murder, she was offered a plea of guilty to first-degree manslaughter, which could have allowed her to avoid a life sentence. She testified that the motive for the crime was money and a personal hatred for her mother. Francesca knew that Teresa controlled her finances and disapproved of her relationship with Kepler. She did not want to put up with her mother's power, and Kepler became a tool to carry out her plan. After the defendant's confessions, the prosecutor's office began preparations for the trial. The first to go on trial was Ralph Kepler. It was he who gave Teresa Kiel the fatal blows and became the perpetrator of the crime. His trial was scheduled for the 30th of December, 2019. Francesca, on the other hand, had made a deal to go to trial after Kepler's sentencing. In her case, the punishment could not be as severe as that of her accomplice. But even with the deal, investigators and prosecutors were sure that she would face a long time behind bars. After Teresa Kiel's death, the trials of Ralph Kepler and Francesca Kiel became inevitable. They were no longer accused of attempted murder, but of premeditated murder. The investigation confidently stated that the crime had been premeditated and motivated by hatred and financial gain. The Nassau County Prosecutor's Office prepared an indictment based on the evidence already collected. They argued that Kepler attacked Teresa Kiel in cold blood, and that her own daughter Francesca not only knew of the pending crime, but actively facilitated it. The court hearings promised to be high profile, as the case caused a wide public outcry. First in the dock was Ralph Kepler, the direct perpetrator of the murder. His trial began on the 30th of December, 2019. Prosecutors insisted that he acted deliberately, and with full knowledge he inflicted the fatal blows with a metal barbell on Teresa Keel. They argued that Kepler had anticipated the victim in advance, and that the attack was not random or spontaneous. The prosecution said he committed the crime in cold blood and in a calculated manner. The defense tried to portray him as a victim of manipulation by Francesca Kiel, claiming that he did not realize the full consequences of his actions and that he was allegedly used. However, the prosecution emphasized that Kepler was a grown man, a former correctional officer, and could not have been unaware of what he was doing. After months of proceedings, the court handed down the sentence on the 30th of June, 2020. 22 years in prison for second-degree murder, conspiracy, and unlawful possession of a weapon. The judge noted that even if Kepler was under Francesca's influence, that does not absolve him of responsibility for the crime. Francesca Kiel, realizing that there was too much evidence against her, made a deal with the investigation and pleaded guilty. This allowed her to avoid a harsher sentence, but did not absolve her of responsibility for her mother's death. Her trial took place on the 8th of September, 2022. Prosecutors argued that she was the one who planned the murder, tracked her mother's movements, and then orchestrated the attack at Kepler's hands. They insisted she wanted to get rid of her mother's control and gain access to money. Francesca's defense tried to portray her as emotionally unstable, claiming that she did not realize what her actions would lead to. However, the court did not accept this argument, finding that she acted deliberately, cold-bloodedly, and methodically.
She co-conspired with her boyfriend to kill her mother. This was over a money issue.
Despite the guilty plea, the judge named her as the mastermind of the crime and noted that she had betrayed her own mother for selfish purposes. The sentence was a stiff 13 years in prison for first-degree manslaughter. After sentencing, the judge emphasized that the crime was unusually cruel because the daughter had deliberately planned the murder of her own mother. The prosecution called what happened a cynical betrayal, and the public was shocked at how easily Francesca Kiel decided to commit the crime. Now Ralph Kepler is serving his 22-year sentence in a maximum security prison, and Francesca Kiel is in a women's correctional facility, where she will spend a significant part of her life. The story of Teresa Kiel's murder was a prime example of how greed and hatred can destroy the strongest bonds. Her own daughter, Francesca Kiel, chose cruelty and calculation over love and respect, giving up her own mother to die for money and freedom from control. Ralph Kepler, a trusted man in law enforcement, found himself willing to commit murder for the promised reward. He became the perpetrator of the crime but could not escape justice. The judicial sentences put a just end to the case, but no punishment can undo the worst of it, the betrayal that led to the death of a mother at the hands of her daughter. This story is a reminder that sometimes the most dangerous people are closer than they seem, and the lust for control and money can eclipse common sense and destroy everything human.